There's a reason why some criminals make the history books and others are never spoken of again. It takes a special kind of messed up to commit the crimes we look at on this channel. But rarely do we ever cover cases that are so disturbing people just stop talking about it. I was super surprised that before researching this case, I'd never heard of the haircut killer. This is a case that takes place in multiple countries and the details are so gruesome it sounds like something out of a horror movie. Maybe that's why nobody ever talks about it. Maybe that's why it took over 20 years for the culprit to be brought to justice. Let's dive in. In 2002, Heather Barnett was a 48-year-old mother of two living in Bournemouth in the UK. As a single parent, Heather worked a lot to make sure her kids, Terry and Caitlin, were always provided for. She worked from home as a seamstress and specialized in making high-quality drapes for the homes of her clients. On November 12, 2002, Heather walked her kids to school and said goodbye to them for the last time. Terry and Caitlin always expected their mom to be home when they got home from school, but on that day, something seemed weird in their house. Some of the furniture was moved like someone had been pushing it around, and when they called out for their mom to see if she was home, they were met with silence, as Terry described in a police interview. The house was silent and I knew something was wrong. I just had one of those feelings in my gut and I did not like it. Before long, Caitlin realized the bathroom door was closed, and that was the only place in the house they hadn't searched yet. They slowly opened the bathroom door, and that's when they found Heather lying in a pool of her own blood. The scene was so grisly that Terry knew straight away that this was no accident fall. Someone had come into their home, butchered their mom, and left her there for her kids to find. Terry, being the older sibling, went straight into protective brother mode and tried to keep Caitlin calm as he contacted the authorities.
I need an ambulance and the police.
I've got officers en route. What's happened?
My mum's just been murdered.
After calling the police, Terry took Caitlin outside so they wouldn't have to be in the house with their mom's body until someone arrived to help. As they ran out of the house, at the same time their neighbors arrived home and immediately rushed over to see what was wrong. They were horrified when the kids told them what had happened, and they took them into their apartment to look after them until the police arrived. When the authorities turned up, they knew straight away that Terry and Caitlin would be scarred forever by the scene they walked in on. It was obvious that Heather had fought her killer for a long time before eventually succumbing to her injuries. Dr. Alan Anscombe arrived at the scene as the pathologist for the case and was able to determine a lot just from the crime scene. He concluded that Heather died due to one of her 10 major head injuries she had. One was so bad that part of her brain was exposed. He found a trail of her blood in from the living room to her sewing room, and finally, the bathroom. He theorized that Heather had died in the sewing room and the culprit then dragged her to the bathroom, where they continued to harm her even though she was dead. There were stab wounds all over her, including her neck and her hands. She'd also had part of her body removed and placed next to her, a sign that the killer had been very precise and calculated. Although there weren't any forensic evidence at the scene, the killer left numerous clues behind. One was a green towel that didn't belong to the Barnett Marsh family and had obviously been used to clean part of the scene. Another was shoe prints made with Heather's blood. The prints were so clear that they were able to determine the size and the brand, which turned out to be a men's Nike sneaker. The prints stopped very suddenly in the middle of a room, which told the police that the culprit must have taken the shoes off and they'd planned far enough ahead that they must have brought a second pair with them. Why would the culprit be so careful not to leave forensic evidence but leave these details behind? But that wasn't the part that caught their attention. In both hands, Heather was holding locks of hair. There was indeed evidence that someone had messily cut her hair after she died, but only one of the locks belonged to her. It was like they'd left these little clues behind as calling cards or a signature as a way to brag to the police about their confidence in getting away with this crime. Psychological traits, needs, and deviancy may be revealed via careful analysis of the signature. Experts believe that a criminal's fantasies are evident in their signature. However, what this deviant didn't think about is that his dramatic signature would lead the authorities right to him. I'm going to take you back almost a decade to 1993, Pontesna, Italy. September 12th was a Sunday, and 16-year-old Elisa Claps was getting ready to go on a date. Elisa was kind of nervous because the guy she was meeting had kind of a reputation. Danilo Restivo was 5 years older than Elisa and studying dentistry. He was kind of known as the town weirdo, and he bothered a lot of the women and girls from the area. He would randomly ask them out on dates, claiming to have gifts for them, and if they rejected, he would go full stalker on them. He would call their houses multiple times a day and play the soundtrack from Profondo Rosso, a movie about a serial killer who would play music before carrying out his crimes. He was also known for sitting behind women on public transport and cutting off chunks of their hair. If this isn't foreshadowing, I don't know what is. Elisa felt bad for Danilo and agreed to meet him after he said he had a gift for her, since she'd just passed some important exams. They arranged to meet at a church in the center of town, and when Elisa left that day going along with a female friend, it was the last time she would be seen for 17 years. After Elisa vanished, Danilo came home with a mysterious cut on his hand, and the head priest of the church, Demica Sabia, suddenly locked off one part of the church and left the city for several weeks. Elisa's brother Gildo worked hard to make authorities take his sister's case seriously, but their willingness to examine the church made sure that no real investigation was carried out. Members of the community suspected Danilo was involved. After all, he was the last person to see her alive, and he had a reputation for making women feel nervous or unsafe. Despite this, the authorities claimed they couldn't find any evidence that Danilo had done anything to make Elisa disappear. However, in 1996, he was charged and found guilty of supplying the police with false information to the police regarding the case. He was sentenced to 20 months in prison, but his sentence was suspended because of how short it was. He was allowed to walk the earth as a free man. In early 2002, Danilo left his home in Italy behind to move in with a woman he'd met on a dating site. She lived in Bournemouth, England, across the street from a lady called Heather Barnett. That's right, when Caitlin and Terry ran out of their house that day, it was directly into the clutches of the man who ended their mom's life. A couple of weeks before she died, Heather had spoken to Danilo in her home when he asked her to make some drapes for his sitting room. After he left, Heather found the spare key to her house was missing, which prompted her to change the locks. During door-to-door searches of the area after Heather passed away, they entered Danilo's house and were met with a strong smell of bleach. His Nike sneakers were soaking in bleach in the bathtub, and this was weird enough to the investigators that they confiscated the sneakers for testing. You'd think pieces of information alone would be enough to charge Danilo, right? Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The investigators needed real, solid evidence that he was involved in Heather's death, and it would take years for them to find it. As with Elisa's case, the police struggled to find anything big that would pin the crime on Danilo. Although at first glance, Danilo seemed bumbling and childish, during police interviews, he seemed not only calm and cool, but prepared for the question they asked him. For several years, the police tracked Danilo, hoping to find something to tie him to Heather's case. What they discovered was pretty disturbing. Not only did they see Danilo cutting the hair of random women on public transport all over the city, but they also caught him watching women walking through parks.
Here he is, filmed by undercover officers, getting changed and then watching women from the bushes.
There were 2 appeals for information on Crime Watch, a popular TV show in the UK that exists to raise awareness for unsolved crimes. This was to try and find the owner of the second lock of hair found at Heather's crime scene. From the analysis of her hair, they could tell which countries the owner had been to in the weeks before it was taken, and that her diet had changed during that time. Unfortunately, no one came forward, and the identity of the owner of the hair remains a mystery to this day. Danilo was searched by the police, and he was acting strangely in public, and they discovered a change of clothes as well as a variety of weapons in his bag. His sneakers were tested for DNA, and blood was found on the inside. They also discovered his DNA on the green towel found in Heather's house. They even had an audio recording of him talking about how much he loved the feeling of holding hair in his hands. Somehow, none of this was enough to charge him. The investigators needed a big break in the case. There was one thing that Danilo truly had against him: his alibi. On the day Heather died, he claimed to be at a computer class and provided the police with a bus ticket to prove that he'd at least been gone at the time she died. However, a digital forensics investigator discovered there was no activity on his account between 9:08 a.m. and 10:10 a.m., the window of time that the authorities believe Heather was murdered. If he wasn't logged in at his class, where was he? And then they got their big break. On March 17th, 2010, construction workers were trying to fix a bad leak in the roof of a church in Potenza, Italy. In the corner of the bell tower, they stumbled across the mummified remains of Elisa Claps. In her hands were strands of hair. In a way, it's kind of lucky that Elisa was found at that time, because if she was found closer to the time she vanished, they may not have had the technology to find Danilo's DNA on her remains. When this discovery was made, Danilo was arrested and charged with Heather's death. This is where things get kind of complicated. Although he wasn't technically charged with Elisa's death, they were allowed to use her case as evidence for the prosecution. Of course, he was found guilty, and the judge that sentenced Danilo was clearly as horrified by his actions as the rest of us. There is, in my judgment, no minimum period which could be properly set. You will never be released from prison. As unfortunate as it is, it took so long to get a dangerous person off the streets. I'm glad that Danilo Restivo is finally behind bars forever. What do you guys think of this case? Do you think there could be more victims out there? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.